Over the course of its 8-year runtime, Game of Thrones took the world by storm. From the moment HBO first brought George R.R. Martin's incredible characters and world building to television screens across the globe, the show became a cultural phenomenon. It was the well-written, high-budget fantasy masterpiece that nerds had been waiting for. But more importantly, it presented itself as one of the more accessible high fantasy shows to grace our living rooms. Its character foundations and storytelling were so good that even your HGTV-obsessed mother and sports-consumed father were tuning in, foregoing the Property Brothers and Sunday Night Baseball in favor of cutthroat Westerosi politics and violent Dothraki fight sequences. Game of Thrones was mainstream, but it stayed true to itself and its narrative consistency, for a time. Despite a problematic 7th season, fans were still breathlessly awaiting the arrival of Season 8 in 2019, the final chapter where loose ends would be tied up and character arcs would be concluded. How would the long-running White Walker plotline be wrapped up? Would Daenerys end up on the Iron Throne? What other names would Arya cross off of her list? How would Jon's parentage come into play? And what would become of Tyrion, Sansa, Cersei, Jaime, Bran, Brienne, the Hound, and the dozens of other characters we came to know and love? We got our answers, and we hated them. The release of Game of Thrones' 8th and final season was an unmitigated disaster. The multitude of issues that fans have with the final 6 episodes of the show have been explained to death across the internet over the last 5 years, so I won't recap every single poor writing decision here. Suffice it to say that even compared to the infamous endings of shows like How I Met Your Mother or The Sopranos, this stood out as arguably the most unsatisfying conclusion to a piece of media that we had ever seen. The core problem of the final season was the rushed nature of its storytelling. With many of the plot lines, the end result was not the issue as much as the way the story arrived at those conclusions. Major character development happened at such a breakneck pace that some of the biggest plot points didn't feel earned. The best example being, major spoiler alert, Daenerys' dark descent in the final 2 episodes. As a result, Season 8 contained much of what many consider to be shock value writing, plot twists for the sake of plot twists, even though the previous 7 seasons didn't necessarily set up those twists in a sensical manner. There are so many talking points surrounding the ending of Game of Thrones, and its relentless pacing sits at the core of most of that criticism. Since the show's ending, public sentiment around the series has shifted significantly. What was once considered an all-time great TV series is now looked back on with frustration and disappointment. The ending of the show was always going to play a huge role in how it was remembered. Such is usually the case with a series like Game of Thrones. This wasn't a sitcom where a few bad seasons at the end may not matter within the context of the pick up and enjoy any random episode nature of a comedy. This wasn't an anthology where each season can stand apart from each other. This wasn't an action-dependent science fiction romp that stayed focused on the thrill ride. This was a character-driven, brilliantly constructed, masterfully interconnected epic. The rise and fall of its morally great characters was so central to the show's identity that throwing all of that away in the end put a sour taste in the mouth of millions of fans. Game of Thrones' legacy will continue to be discussed at length for decades to come. When I sat down to rewatch the show a few months ago, I tried to go into the experience with an open mind. Maybe the fall from grace wasn't as bad as I remember it being. Maybe it won't sting as badly after 5 years now that I've had some time to reflect. Maybe I'll actually enjoy it? Nope. Still bad. But even though I still view the ending of Game of Thrones to be one of the greatest tragedies in the history of entertainment media, I did walk away with a bit of a different perspective. That of a Game of Thrones fan. A fan that could more easily appreciate the genius behind everything that led up to that fateful finale. During a recent conversation I had with a few friends regarding our favorite shows, I was asked whether or not I would recommend Game of Thrones to someone who'd never seen it before. 5 years ago, my answer to that question would have been a resounding no. I would have said something along the lines of Season 8 ruined everything they set up and you're just going to be pissed off by the end. I considered the ending to be such a resounding betrayal of the story that the journey was simply not worth the destination. Today, my answer to that question is much different. Today, I would say that while the ending will absolutely still frustrate most viewers, Game of Thrones as a whole is still well worth a watch because of how utterly fantastic its bones are, how phenomenal its characters, world, and early plot lines are, how much good there is, even despite the bad. Game of Thrones is a great example of a classic conundrum. Is it better to have had and lost, or to not have had at all? Is the pain of something ending worth the joy of experiencing it in the first place, even if it doesn't end how you want it to? Of course the dozens of hours you spend enjoying the show is worth the final few hours falling short. Of course the game that you had fun playing is worth the final boss battle that was too easy. Of course the relationship was worth the breakup. Of course we'll accept death if it gives us life. So watch the show, and recognize that the end sucks if you think it sucks. But for everything that doesn't suck, recognize that too. Recognize the beauty of the journey, and not just the destination. Recognize that the reason you're so disappointed is because you love it so much, because it spoke to you so deeply. Recognize that there's more to life than the way everything comes together in the end, that how you get there matters even more, that the moments you spend creating the story are just as important as the moments that wrap it all up.